Alrighty, good afternoon, everybody. It is a little bit past 12, and I think we'll go ahead and get started. So today we are here for a pre-con workshop titled The Incoherent Truth, Advancing Methodological Coherence in Qualitative Counseling Research. So again, really just trying to hone in on our qualitative research skills today. I'm gonna go ahead and introduce myself. So I might be familiar to some of you in the room. I see some familiar faces, I see some new faces, so welcome. But my name is Cameron Washington. I'm a certified genetic counselor. I have practiced in clinic for 5 years with the Greenwood Genetics Center, recently completed a fellowship in genetics education and engagement, and also myself have some research experience actually using data to tell stories. So whether that be in advocacy for neurofibromatosis type 1, whether it be on applying whole genome sequencing to diagnosing rare diseases, or even using data to see how we can use utilization management to save hospitals money. So I've had my foot in a bit of research experience. And so today I'm actually switching gears. I'm gonna not be the research expert in the room, but actually just walk everyone through our session today. So my roles as defined here are really to facilitate today's orientation, get us engaged and excited about being here a day before the conference starts. I'm also gonna be signaling breaks because we do have breaks scheduled today. We can't use our brain the entire time. So we'll have 2 15-minute breaks scheduled throughout today. I'll also make sure that we're staying on time. We only have a limited amount of time together, so we're gonna make sure we get it through everything. I'm also gonna be helping pass out the microphones and just some general assistance. So that is where you'll see me throughout after getting off the stage today. So just defining where we are, today's workshop's gonna last 5 hours. So we have it booked from 12 to 5:30 p.m., just as an FYI. We will have 2 15-minute breaks, as I've mentioned. I also have the CEU code available. If you guys are ready, I'll say it now, but I'll make sure to say it several times throughout the session. But today's CEU code is 50324. Again, today's CEU code is 50324. And you'll get that multiple times throughout the day, but that is the first one. I'm also going to show you that we have a link that was sent to you in the email blast that is a link to Padlet that has all of the resources in a digital format for you. So I'm going to exit out of the screen so you should be able to see what the Padlet looks like. It has information for our papers that we'll be using. It has some videos there. It also has our simulated questions. So you can also have that as an additional tab in one of your browsers if you'd like to follow along with us to make sure you have these materials post-workshop. Fantastic. And as an emphasis, today is going to focus really on positionality, really understanding what that is, how we use it, as well as methodological coherence within your qualitative research. But I want to be clear, today's workshop will not cover all nuances of qualitative research, and today's session will also not be recorded. So we're kind of setting our expectations for what we're getting into. Actually, go ahead. I'm going to repeat what Rachel said. The content will be recorded, but the activities will not. There we go. I do want to give you a quick primer to what we're going to be talking about today. This is the very, very tip of the iceberg. Our expert speakers will be going much deeper beneath the iceberg with these two concepts, but I do want to introduce them here. The first concept is on positionality, and the second is on methodological coherence. As an FYI, coherence and congruence will be used interchangeably today. So when you see those in the notes or in the paperwork, they're the same thing. A brief introduction on positionality. So positionality is a brief statement that acknowledges the ways in which your biases, your life experiences, or conflicts of interest could influence the lens at which you view your work or your research project. We're going to dive into how to draft a positionality statement today, why it's important, but I do want to emphasize that a positionality statement is not a list of all your identities, and it is not an apology letter to your reader. We'll dive into the nuances today to make sure that we can craft a positionality statement, and hopefully you can leave understanding the value of one. Next is methodological coherence or congruence. And this concept really asks yourself as the researcher, do the components of your research, the philosophical underpinnings, the research questions, the theoretical frameworks, the research design, the methods, the analysis, does that all align logically and create a unified, credible research framework? If it looks rigorous, it's because it is. Qualitative research does have a rigorous component to it, and we want to make sure that we're holding us to our standards to produce great work. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing you to our three speakers today. We have Kim Zahowski, Krista Redlinger-Grossi, and then Tasha Weinstein. These will be our speakers that will be leading us beneath the iceberg today with those two concepts. We also have the pleasure of having some general assistants today and some facilitators to help you through some of the workshops and activities that we're going to be doing today, and their names are listed here. If you are a facilitator or a general assistant, would you mind raising your hand and waving to the audience? Beautiful. So these guys will be working with you guys today, our attendees, to help us through the activities. And they'll be dispersed out at each table, so you have at least one. All right. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to your first speakers, Tasha Weinstein and Krista Redlinger-Grossi. I also was instructed before I let you go that the Wi-Fi password is in all caps. Okay, so if you needed to connect, it's nsgc25 in all caps. Now that the Wi-Fi is out of the way, let me welcome to the stage Tasha Weinstein and Krista Redlinger-Grossi. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Cameron. Hi, everyone. Firstly, thank you so much for joining us today. It really makes me very happy to see people who are interested in really figuring out how we can do high quality qualitative research. So I'm thrilled that you're all here. I also just wanted to acknowledge that before we even start, there's a ton of experience in this room. And so even though myself and Krista and Kim are here as speakers, we do really want to just acknowledge that everyone here brings something to this conversation, whether you have a little experience with qualitative research or you've actually done this quite a bit. So please feel free to make comments, ask questions, interrupt, at least me, I'm comfortable with that, as we go. I really am hoping that we can have a really great interactive dialogue. Probably should have started on the time. Okay, so just some formalities very quickly. Neither Krista nor I have any conflicts of interest to declare. And in the interest of practicing what we preach, we're just going to share our positionality statements with you very quickly. So I am a cis-het woman of European ancestry. I am originally from South Africa, but I now live in Canada as an uninvited settler on the traditional unceded ancestral territories of the Coast Salish peoples, namely the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, which is colonially known as Vancouver, British Columbia. So not too far from Vancouver, Washington. So professionally speaking, I have clinical and research training and experience as a genetic counselor. And I personally align myself and my own research with non-positivist, interpretivist, or constructivist paradigms of qualitative research. But I'm very cognizant of the fact that there is a much greater breadth of alignment within the genetic counseling profession. And so I try to teach or ensure that what I teach is helpful across this breadth.
Welcome. Good to see everybody. I'm Krista Redlinger-Grossi, as Cameron mentioned, she, her pronouns. Happy to share sort of my positionality and how it informs both how I look at research, how I interpret research, and conduct research. So I identify as a cis-het partnered mother who was adopted from Korea, immigrated to my parents who are Swedish, Scandinavian Minnesotans. And I think that's important to mention because I know exteriorly I represent sort of Asian culture, but interiorly was really raised in a very socially privileged educational prioritized background. Professionally, I'm both a genetic counselor and a psychologist, so I really blend both of those worlds. Right now, I work in training, but I also work clinically with families and individuals impacted by genetic risk and disease. So I hear the stories and the experiences. So you will not be surprised that I certainly value the experience in the stories. And so that is where, as a researcher, I come to you more from a constructivist, interpretivist lens. I can't help but let go of that third eye and what I hear in therapy and co-construct with my clients into the research lens in which I view both conducting research and the importance of lifting up those stories, but also in working with students that I mentor. I also am going to briefly confess, I'm feeling a lot of imposter syndrome standing in front of you today, just because I will consider myself a part-time researcher, which does feel a bit of a confession in this room. But I think it's important because I think I walk the walk of learning research by doing. And so just really appreciate and want to bring that bias to you.
Okay, so just to finish off with our formalities and check in for a moment. In the videos that we sent out for you to watch beforehand, we covered a lot of the basics about philosophies and paradigms and methodology and methods. And what we're really hoping to do now is talk about how we put all of these concepts together in a way that I suppose makes logical sense and is in alignment, which is really what Cameron was alluding to when he was talking about methodological coherence or congruence, and it does have a number of other names as well. So you're going to hear those kinds of terms: methodological integrity, paradigmatic integrity. They all mean the same thing. It's how do we put this all together in a logical way, essentially, that makes sense within the constructs that we've spoken about. I also just want to say that a lot of what myself and Krista are going to be talking about is covered in a manuscript that I have written on this topic, which is currently under revision. So hopefully that will be something that can be sent out to participants once it is eventually, hopefully, published. Okay, so why do we want to focus on methodological congruence? Well, I think really it's because it has to do with quality and rigor in qualitative research. So one of the helpful ways to understand this idea is to think about it in the context of quantitative research. And in that space, regardless of the specifics of a quantitative study, we tend to have 4 things that everybody is sort of in agreement on that makes quantitative research high quality. And those 4 things, as you can see, are validity, reliability, objectivity, and reproducibility. Okay, and it's pretty constant. And that's helpful because when we're reviewing or writing or editing, those are the things we're looking for. Now, the challenge is that's not the case when it comes to qualitative research, right? There's really 2 main issues here. One is that when we are reviewing or editing or even putting together our qualitative research, often we will default, unfortunately, or perhaps erroneously, to quantitative ways of understanding quality. And that's something that happens not just within the genetic counseling profession. This is very broadly speaking qualitative research. The other problem is that because we have such a ton of variety within the context of qualitative research, it's really difficult to find even one thing, let alone 4 things that apply appropriately across all of the different paradigms and methodologies and ideas we have in qualitative research. And so this is sort of my offering to you all as possibilities of how we can achieve some degree of quality regardless of which paradigm we're working in and what our specifics are with respect to the qualitative research that we want to do. So there are methodological congruence, and then very related to that is the idea of knowingness and transparency. And I'm going to explain what all of these words mean. So as you've heard already, methodological congruence is really about this aspect of alignment. So methodological congruence will exist in your study when the purpose, the research questions or the aims, the theoretical assumptions, the paradigms, the data gathering techniques, the data analysis, all of it is in alignment and makes conceptual sense with everything else that you have done, okay? Knowingness is really the idea that the researcher themselves needs to understand and clearly communicate the meaning of the concepts that they're using within the chosen paradigm, okay? So this is kind of a little bit of like an internal thing for you to know what you're doing, okay, as the study here. Understand what you are doing, why you're doing it, and that how you're doing it makes conceptual sense. And then finally, transparency is about our responsibility to really articulate all of this clearly for the knowledge users or for the audience so that they can take whatever you've put in your paper and make an assessment that, yes, this is high quality, this is really a rigorous study, because you've given that opportunity to them by being transparent about all the aspects and the decision-making behind your choices, okay? So transparency is kind of the relationship that you build with the audience around, how you've done what you have done, and that they can then use that information to evaluate the quality of it. What's also important to understand about these concepts is that they are very much interrelated ideas. So they don't each stand on their own. They're not mutually exclusive. So for example, transparency requires that the researcher knows what they're doing. Okay? You can't explain it to somebody else if you personally don't actually understand it, right? But also they have a lot of flexibility. So for example, a researcher can be knowingly methodologically incongruent, but they can still ensure a high quality product if they are reporting that incongruence using transparency. Okay, so some flexibility in there, some overlap in the concepts. Okay then, so how can we know then if what we're doing is methodologically congruent? So this is one framing that I've personally found to be really helpful. And it's this typology of qualitative traditions known as the small q and big Q. Some of you may have heard of this already. But essentially what you're seeing in this image, at the top of the image, is the spectrum of paradigms. So on the one side, we have our positivist or post-positivist paradigms. And on the opposite side, the other end of the spectrum, we have our more non-positivist ideas, the interpretivist, constructivist, critical theory, indigenous theories, etc., would fall on the other end of the spectrum, okay? And then what we have on the one side of the Venn diagram in yellow, we have this idea of small q, qualitative research. So small q is where the qualitative aspect of the research is really defined by collecting and analyzing qualitative data. Okay, so we're going to use things like interviews, focus groups to gather the data. But the way that we analyze the data tends to be underpinned by values that default to disciplinary norms. So they default to the idea of post-positivist and quantitative ideas of quality. So that's sort of where you're analyzing your interview data or whatever data you've gathered in a way that leans towards finding an objective singular truth that is in the data waiting to be found, rather than the opposite end, which is your big Q idea. And big Q really involves both the use of these qualitative techniques, so the interviews and the focus groups, and also the distinct values and traditions that have developed within qualitative methods around subjectivity, co-creation, contextualization, the role of the researcher being integral to the actual conduct of the research. So it's kind of leaning into all of that as an idea. So basically how you can achieve methodological congruence is really by staying within one of these circles or the other. And it's not, rather than crossing between the two, okay? So if you are doing something that's more post-positivist, your data analysis approaches and your quality practices should come from that side of the circle. And the same is true if you're doing a more big Q kind of constructivist approach. Now you'll see, of course, that there is this little bit in between called medium Q. And this is an intermediate type. But the key thing here is medium Q is when you are knowingly and transparently, remember those terms, drawing on concepts from both small q and big Q approaches, but you're doing it with a clear rationale and good justification. Okay, so you're not just randomly saying, oh, I feel like doing this and I heard about that one, so I'm going to throw that in there. You're making decisions that are justified based on some need that you have in the research. Okay, and that's how you can achieve methodological congruence. Okay, so what I've also done is put together my 10 questions for methodological coherence. And this is just an internal check you can use for yourself when you're conducting or even reporting your qualitative research, right? So I'm going to quickly, I'm not going to read all of it. I'm just going to briefly go through it before I hand over to Krista to work through some examples with all of you. But essentially the key thing is starting by having, sorry, getting all excited here, is by starting from the point of explicitly stating what paradigm you're in. Okay, we can't assess quality in any way if we don't know the parameters of what we're assessing. Okay, so that's the really key step to first step to achieving methodological coherence, is tell me what paradigm you're working in. And then from there, I can measure in some way that feels appropriate to the rest of the project, or what the report is, that this is coherent. It makes sense what you've done. Okay, there's logic in here. Something else that is helpful to do is actually justify why that paradigm is appropriate for the question. And we're going to have practice with that when we work on one of our activities later, is thinking of a question and what paradigm would work with that question and how we know that that makes sense together. Okay, and the same is true for all of the other aspects of your methodology. Explaining what data collection or gathering tools and techniques you've used, explaining what data analysis you've used, and justifying why those are the appropriate tools and techniques to be doing. Justifying things like your participant group size. So there's lots of debates around those kinds of issues, but also helping you to convey to your users that your participant group is the right group of people to be answering this particular question, and you've spoken to enough of them for whatever reasons that you use that information to justify that this is appropriate. And this applies across the board to how you report your findings, how you link the aim of your study, whether it was to describe something, to theorize about something, to make something applicable in some sort of clinical context, whatever it is, that matches with what you've produced, okay? And then I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this because it's very much Kim's talk, but describing and discussing your positionality in a way that allows readers, again, to have that transparency of how that influenced everything that you've done. And I will certainly say that that does not only account for big Q approaches. I think there's a lot of value in having that kind of information in small Q approaches. And the reason for that is because in a small Q approach, you might need to work a little bit harder to help people understand how you mitigated those positionalities in terms of achieving objectivity. Whereas in big Q, the subjectivity is a key component of the research that you want to demonstrate to your audience and your knowledge users of how that influenced what you've done and why your analysis looks the way it does. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and hand over to Krista, who's going to hopefully bring this all to life with you with some really great practical examples.
I am short. I can't see. Can I do that? Okay, thank you. They needed a stool here for me. So we are going to just put this all together. So this is a figure that I took from an article by Michael Crotty that I think gives us a way to visualize. I'm a visual person, but also to kind of put this all together. Now, what I would have liked is for this pyramid to not all fit nicely, but you get the idea. We talked in the pre-work videos about building blocks, and here we have the building blocks. So if we start on this foundational level, we have what I would call our philosophical positions. Now, Michael Crotty talks about epistemology, how we know what we know. But I would also include in that axiology as well as ontology in terms of what we value, what we believe to be true. We take those philosophical positions and we put them into our theoretical perspective or a philosophic stance. A lot of words here. But remember from the pre-work videos when we talked about our research paradigms, I like the real examples. So this is where the degree doctor, introduced to me by Tasha, I went in a rabbit hole watching those YouTube videos one night, but talks about our cliques, our social high school, middle school, elementary school cliques in terms of the science geeks. We have our artists, we have our social justice warriors, and we have our all-rounders. So how do we put in these philosophical positions into also then how we, our paradigms? Methodology is then this larger theoretical framework in which we have this plan of action. These are the big five that Tasha talked about in our pre-work videos, are things like narrative inquiry, phenomenology, ethnography, case studies. There's a fifth of which I'm not remembering right now, but you get the idea. And then how do we execute these things? That is our methods. Those are our techniques. That's how we gather data. That's how we analyze the data. And then that's also, I believe, how we are going to then present them to you. So I would have liked this to look like Jenga, right? Do you all know Jenga? So if, and I'm terrible at it because I have no spatial awareness, as you can see from this microphone situation. But if you don't have one of these, I call Jenga on you. And so if you start at the top, which is, I think, something, again, here's my second confession of the afternoon, I have been known to do, right? Because how do I need to get this project done for a student in a year who actually waited for 6 months to like start the project? You know, we go to the top of the pyramid, but then I'm going to call Jenga on you because we haven't set the foundation. We're all genetic counselors here. I think this is equivalent to things like starting a session without contracting, without assessing, without tailoring, and just spewing information. Again, that's my bias as a psychologist, right? So let's not play the game of Jenga. This is methodological congruence. Here was me at 4 in the morning on Central Time today. But this is all spinning in your head. So I'm going to ask actually for us to use some hypothetical examples from Tasha's paper to put this into execution. So I am super sorry if you are an introvert. I am partnered to one, but I am going to ask you to participate here. So if you are at a table all by your lonesome, that's totally fine, and you can do this work on your own. But I actually also would like you to talk with one another as we present these hypothetical research questions to one another. Sorry if you don't want to move, but you are welcome to move if you want to. Okay. And I'm not afraid to call on people. I'm sorry. So here is our question. How do genetic counselors convey uncertainty in the context of a genetic test result? What a great question. Okay. What do you notice in this question? So let's pick this apart. Turn to your neighbor or yourself inwardly and say, what do you see in this question? Take 10 seconds, because again, I don't want you to pick it apart too much. Cameron, you're going to cut me off if I go too long, right? Okay, thank you. Okay, we're going to go. Okay. Popcorn it out. Use your loud voice because this is a ginormous room. What do we notice about this question?
Cameron and I also have microphones.
Ooh, fancy. Okay. Thank you. Just scream at Cameron. Great. Yeah, uncertainty, huge, the big U. Yeah. What type of question is this? I'm going to prompt us along in light of time. It's a how question. Excellent, right? So you have a big concept of uncertainty and a process and a how, okay? So let's go to what philosophical paradigm, right? Think about your clicks, would work best. Now, again, we are going to argue there isn't a best, so I guess I should retract that word. But what would you choose based on a how question and a large concept of uncertainty? What's your gut tell you? Somebody, anyone? Cindy's got like big eyes. I don't know.
How would I do it? Because I am way out in that positive
Yep.
space,
Okay, that's
which is
good.
not news to you.
Own it, Cindy. Yeah.
So how? I'd be real tempted to record genetic counseling sessions and code the transcript.
Right. Great. So
I'm
this,
gonna like stand up and cheer for that response.
yeah.
I love it.
Yeah. And what I'm going to cheer about is, here's the thing. This is from the top 10 questions as a reviewer, as a student, as a researcher, right? have you explained how the philosophical assumptions of the chosen paradigms support the nature of your research question? So what we just heard from Cindy is, I don't know everybody's name, so I'm sorry, but what we heard is that I'm on this side. I'm sort of more the positivist. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to actually look at transcripts and look at specific knowns that I want to see. So let's jump ahead. I'm going to speed us up here. Let's actually go a little in between and choose, for the sake of argument, a pragmatic approach or paradigm. Okay. These are the all-rounders, right? And they also are somebody who is going to want, as a researcher, some practical takeaways from understanding or maybe looking at those transcripts. In this case, we're actually going to choose things like semi-structured one-on-one interview with an interpretive description, okay, in terms of the analysis procedure, which again is born out of a methodological approach that gives us those practical takeaways. And we're going to describe how we had rigor in terms of this. Let's say you're a reviewer here and you're seeing that the analysis moves beyond description and theorizing into interpretation. It's in the name, interpretive description. So you're not only describing, but you're interpreting. But then this third piece, knowledge mobilization, is built into the study design logic. So there are takeaways. So show of hands, and we're not recording this in terms of prosperity, but methodologically congruent, who says yes? Who says no? Who's unsure? Okay, that's fine. Okay. I'm going to tell you that we're actually we're looking at congruence, right? Because, and in light of time, I'd really want you to talk about this amongst yourself and kind of figure out, but what we're seeing is a through line in terms of the pragmatic paradigm into how then we collected data, this methodology that is chosen and executed as well as demonstrated back to that transparency in terms of how it is presented. We're going to rush to a second example. How is parental identity development affected by a positive NIPT finding? I love this question, right? So what we're going to notice here is maybe something different. We do have a how, right? But we have this very large concept of identity. And as a psychologist, we are all continually trying to figure out identity. So there's a process. And then we have affected, which I would argue we also have an experience or a lived kind of knowing. So if we use the same table, and I'm sorry to not kind of do more interaction here, but interpretive, we're going to take an interpretivist paradigm approach, right? Co-constructing of meaning, experiences. And so we're going to do in-depth interviews. So we might have smaller numbers, but the depth and richness that's going to come out of these interviews may be a little bit different than that first question in terms of we're looking for kind of more takeaways, but here we're actually doing a ground up approach, which is the analysis procedure we're choosing. Interpretive, phenomenological analysis, phenomenology, lived experiences. Okay. All is looking good. All's good with the world. Like I haven't called Jenga yet. But here we are. Themes are descriptive, reflecting topics of conversations or broad strokes rather than underlying meaning. Okay, this is where I gotcha, right? So, show of hands, methodological congruence, yes? Kim's doing like this already. No? Okay. Right. Because in interpretivist, we want that deeper, ground-up co-construction of kind of what the meaning is around these experiences about identity being affected by this positive result. Last but not least, what are the long-term psychological implications of the identification of long QT syndrome as a secondary finding in adults? If we had time, but we don't. So you're off the hook a little bit. But again, think through. Here's a question. We notice a difference here. What? You know, how does that dictate sort of the context as well as the population you're studying, which then will dictate the paradigm. Then how do you want to gather your data? How do you want to analyze it? And then how do you transparently present that data? So let's pretend you're the reviewer on this study, and here is what you see. If I start from the second box, because this kind of gives it away, right? Digital diary entries that were analyzed thematically, use of a code book, constant comparison, and bias bracketing. But we don't know the paradigm. So how do we know, again, if that bottom layers of the foundation are not there, how are we to evaluate methodology and methods? So we're stuck here. We don't know. Jenga. And third confession, third and last confession, right? I've been here. I've reviewed these studies. I've done these studies. This is sometimes when this starting at the top of the pyramid, forgetting some of the intentionality around the chosen piece of paradigm and methodology. Okay, so to summarize, hopefully the pre-work videos as well as our discussion this, I keep wanting to say morning because it's morning in my body, the philosophical positions, right? These bottom layers of the foundation inform then our research paradigm. We fit them into then how we want to approach and what we bring to light in our, I don't know where I'm at, things, in our data analysis procedures. So our methodology and our methods. But as Tasha has talked to you, we need to ensure congruence by both knowing what we're doing, so the intentionality around it, but then sharing what we know. So here's our takeaways. Oh, look at, they're all number one. We can't choose one. So one size does not fit all, right? There's many paths you can go about in answering these research questions, but you have to choose the path that best fits to where you want to lead to. Genetic counseling research, yay, is not prescriptive about philosophical paradigms and the methods used, so you need to know. You need to have that knowingness to understand what is available to you, what are the tools in your toolbox, so that you can best choose the paradigms that fit the research question. And finally, as you write this up, as you share your research with the world, you want to demonstrate methodological congruence because you started that way. You did your research in terms of the knowingness, and then you shared it in terms of transparency. A treasure trove of articles awaits you in the special issue by the Journal of Genetic Counseling that goes into some of these different methodologies, talks a bit more about positionality. So I ask you to go there in terms of some deeper work.
Thank you, everybody.
I went over, I'm sorry.
For Tasha and Krista. Alrighty, participants, we have time for 2 questions before we go to Kim's talk on positionality. I'll have someone on Rachel's side of the room with a microphone, and I can take somebody on my side of the room. Questions for the panel? Please say your name and your question.
Hi, my name's Abby. I'm from Cincinnati Children's, and I just had a question on one of the last examples you were presenting when they didn't know what, they didn't have everything in order, and you were saying when you read the paper you can tell. I'm curious when you're reading a method section of a paper, how you can tell they didn't go through all the steps and didn't exactly know all of the steps of it, if that makes sense. What stands out?
I'm going to pull it up just for the sake of illustration.
Yeah, sure. So I think part of it is in the, for example, in this case, it's really something it's just not there. It's not stated. So especially at the paradigm level, and I think this is probably the first comment, and Kim can talk as well from her perspective, but on any paper that comes through, we probably should have said that both Kim and I are deputy editors of the Journal of Genetic Counseling, responsible for qualitative research specifically. One of the first comments that I tend to send to authors back is, you haven't stated what the paradigm is. So what you're doing is you're leaving people to make assumptions. And so sometimes it's clear because they've used ideas that are clearly positivist. So perhaps, for example, they have multiple coders, and those coders are working towards consensus through things like intercoder reliability. And they've used something like bias bracketing to cordon off their positionality, and they've used, trying to think, classic grounded theory, which we know is something that's positivist. So I can make assumptions based on what they've done, but I could be wrong because it is an assumption. And so that's why it's always just best to state explicitly what is the paradigm that you're using, so that your readers can then assess the methodological congruence. I think that answers the question. Yeah? Good. Okay, good.
Good time for one more question. Please state your name and your question.
Hi, Louise Beer from Mount Sinai. You talked about finding yourself starting accidentally towards the top of the pyramid.
That was me. I don't want to put that on Tasha.
No,
Sorry,
no,
I was
absolutely
seeing
do
you
that. I've done
and
that.
looking at you, but unclearly.
No.
So, but I'm wondering if you find yourself in that position, how is there a way to kind of go back and try to right the ship a little bit? What do you do if you're in that position and still want to guide yourself or a student into a successful end product?
I mean, I think that we all actually have really good research instincts, right? But the intentionality might not have been there. And actually, this relates to the first question when I review papers, and I worry they're sort of retrofitting. And so I think then you do take a step back, right? And try to then start from the bottom and go back up. I know that the luxury of time, trust me, right? 6 months and I got to get the student graduated isn't there. But I think that the sort of long-term benefits of taking the time to do that step back are really there. And doing sort of those 10 questions and examining and seeing what is there, what is not there, why is it not there? And then also, you know, I've been in situations where, you know, we have some data and some of it does fit and some of it doesn't. And so I do feel like that at some point you can be transparent about the process in which you retrofitted. Tasha?
I was going to exactly say that last point as well, as I think that's where the transparency can come in a little, and sort of just being really kind of honest with your readers and saying, you know, we started at this point and after a lot of reflection, we realized this is actually what we should be doing. And so we course corrected. And I personally value seeing that in a paper, because I'm like being invited into this process, and that really helps me to get to the understanding and meet the authors where they have gotten to in terms of what they're putting forward as analysis and how I can use that information then in whatever way I need to use it. So I agree with this. I think that can be really helpful. But it's a really tough situation to be in. I think we've all been there, and the pressures of having to supervise students and get this done in the time frame is really challenging. But I think, you know, my hope is that everybody here will take this back to your teams and really try to work towards doing this really well in the first place, so we don't end up in those situations, because there's so much to be gained from doing really high quality qualitative research. Thanks for the question.
All right, one last time for Tasha and Krista, guys. Round of applause. We're welcoming up to the stage Ms. Kim Zahowski.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for having us and for being here. My name is Kim Zahowski. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm going to be talking about positionality. I have no relevant conflicts of interest to disclose. And again, I think before I get into this talk, it's only fair that I discuss my own positionality as it relates to research. So I am the assistant program director at Boston University's genetic counseling program. And in the program, most of what I do is working in the research curriculum, mentoring students on their research projects, as well as working in the research class. As Tasha said, I'm also one of the deputy editors for the Journal of Genetic Counseling. So quite literally, if you submit a qualitative manuscript to JOGC, me or Tasha will be reading it. So this is in partnership with the Journal of Genetic Counseling. I'm also one of the directors of diversity, equity, and inclusion integration, which means that we're setting standards for how DEI is incorporated into the journal. In my own front, my own research really focuses on LGBTQIA identities as it relates to genetic counseling, more specifically transgender healthcare in the cancer setting. As a queer person, I'm just personally invested in making sure that we do better. I'm also Vietnamese and white and do research related to how BIPOC students experience genetic counseling graduate school programs. I usually make a joke about how I use my cat to spread the gay agenda. So there's Milo. And so my goal in this talk is to talk about how personal identity, biases, and experiences shape research design, findings, and interpretation, and to understand how to actually craft a positionality statement. I also want to acknowledge that much of what I'm talking about is related to an article that me, Kennedy Borley, and Nadine Chinawi wrote for Journal of Genetic Counseling. I'm going to show you some of the tables that come from that article. There's a QR code and it's also on the Padlet. And so before we get into best practices, let's pause on what positionality means. Positionality is essentially your viewpoint, how your identity, experiences, values affect how you see and interpret the world and your research. It recognizes that none of us exist in a vacuum. We bring ourselves, our backgrounds, our biases into every step of the research process. Reflexivity involves an ongoing self-awareness, critical evaluation, and actions taken in response to understanding a researcher's positionality and how that influences the research process. So I think a lot of us are trained to think about research and data as objective, but the reality is in any type of research, including quantitative research, our worldviews really shape how that research is done, from what questions we choose to ask, to how we collect the data, to how we analyze it, and even how we report findings. Our perspectives inevitably influence that work. And it's also important to think about how power dynamics exist in research. Who gets to define the problem? What voices are amplified and what voices are left out? As researchers, especially those of us who work with marginalized communities, we carry a certain level of authority, and that comes with responsibility. And so again, we don't come into research as blank slates, whether we're conscious of it or not. Our race, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic background, education, work experiences, they shape our interpretations and our decisions. So again, the key points of positionality are to think about how does our identity and experiences really shape our work. In the paper that I was talking about, these subtitles are in a really inconvenient place, but we'll go with it. We talk about 3 aspects of reflexivity that we should think about throughout the entire research process, not just when you're writing the manuscript. So when you're thinking about your study design, your research question, your interpretation, throughout constantly asking yourselves and your research teams about how you relate to your data, how you relate to your participants, and how you relate to your eventual audience. So as a researcher, for example, what do I know about the subject? What are my academic or lived experiences that shape what have given me knowledge on this subject? With what voice do I share my perspectives? Who else besides me is best suited for this research? Asking ourselves these questions early really also help us shape our research team. Who are we missing? Who should we be adding to our research team? We also want to think about how we relate to our participants. How does the community that we're working with know what they know about the subject matter? How might they perceive me? Why might they perceive me that way? And the eventual audience. What is the expected knowledge base of the eventual audience of this research? What are the takeaway messages I want them to get? What tone of voice might I want to exude? And what viewpoints might the future audience have that I share with them or might not share with them? Okay, now actually crafting the positionality statement. So positionality statement is usually in the methods section of a manuscript, and it's really a narrative in which a researcher articulates their background for the audience to be transparent about their own positionality as it relates to the research. So we want to think about relevant aspects of our personal identity, whether that's related to our gender or our race or our education, and how that works with research. I say relevant, and I'll get into this more, because often we get laundry lists of just social identities without actually thinking critically about how those identities shape our work. We also want to think about our research background or our clinical background often. How does our research training and past experiences shape our approach? Like, am I a cancer genetic counselor and I'm working on an article on hereditary cancer risk? That's probably something that I should be disclosing to my reader. Or do we have oncologists on the research team, for example? And we also want to reflect on whether we are an insider or an outsider of the group being studied. And I think this is really, again, important if we're thinking about research with minoritized communities, that we're transparent about that. And I'll get to that in a moment too. So this is an identity map that talks about some different aspects of our identities, race, ethnicity, immigration status, language, age, employment, incarceration, things like that. And so it's important to be intimately aware of kind of what our different positionalities are. But again, we're not always going to be reporting all different aspects of this because maybe some of this isn't directly relevant to the research at hand. And so again, in that article, I have this table that's pulled directly from the article that talks about some of the different things you might want to reflect on as it relates to your research project. So what social identities do I have that relate to a research project? Am I an insider or an outsider of the group? What is my relationship to study participants? Maybe I am an outsider of the group, but I work with the group very frequently in an advocacy or work setting. That's important to discuss. Like in our life experiences, do I have previous or current jobs that are relevant? What volunteering might have done that's related to it? How does this all shape my knowledge about the topic? Do I have any political, philosophical, or theoretical beliefs that are relevant? What disciplinary training we have, like in most genetic counseling research, we should probably talk about if we are trained as genetic counselors, for example, or even if you work in a specific setting. And what are the guiding values and objectives of our research? So my next couple slides, I'm going to be talking about some common mistakes that we see at JOGC when people are writing positionality statements. And my example, I'm going to use broadly myself if I'm thinking about research with transgender patients in a cancer setting. So here's what I'm calling a bad example. As a genetic counselor with experience seeing diverse patient populations, I recognize the importance of equitable and inclusive care for all. While I personally hold majority identities, I'm committed to supporting transgender and gender diverse individuals through my research. My professional training empathizes empathy, cultural competence, and respect for all patients, and I strive to bring those values to my work. I've aimed to conduct this study objectively and ensure that my personal background does not bias my interpretation of the data. I'm going to pause for 5 seconds and let you think about why this is a bad positionality statement. And you might laugh, but this is actually like often we're asking authors to write positionality statements, and this is kind of what we get back a lot. So my thoughts about this are, while this would be a very positivist approach to a positionality statement, I'm saying I'm trying to conduct this study objectively, and in most qualitative research, we don't try to conduct studies objectively. But more than that, I don't actually really say anything in this statement. I'm a genetic counselor. I have diverse experiences. I hold majority identities. What does that mean? In what regard? In relation to what? I support empathy. Okay, that doesn't actually say anything as it relates to the research process. So this is actually just like a extremely empty paragraph. Now I'm going to go to the other end of what can be a bad example. I'm going to read it out loud, and let's see if I butcher this one too. I'm a queer, cisgender woman, Vietnamese and white, multilingual, non-religious, and have experience working in urban and rural settings. I'm trained as a genetic counselor with experience in a variety of clinics, such as cardiac, neuro, cancer, and general adult, and have conducted research on patient experiences in a variety of healthcare contexts. All of these aspects of my identity and background influence how I approach the study. This is also very common in what we see. I'm going to pause for a couple seconds so you can reflect on why. So again, this is what I would call an identity dump. I don't think most of this background is likely related to my research topic, unless I'm specifically talking about religion or specifically talking about many different types of clinics. This is extraneous information that we don't need to be including in the manuscript that again is on transgender healthcare in hereditary cancer. So there's a lot of extraneous information that's probably not needed. So this is what I'm going to call a better example. So my better example is I'm a queer cisgender woman and genetic counselor with experience in cancer genetics clinics and qualitative research on transgender health. My clinical and research training are grounded in biomedical frameworks that may reflect cisnormative assumptions about sex and gender. To enhance reflexivity and accountability, I've maintained reflexive journals and sought input from transgender colleagues and community advisors throughout the study design and analysis. So in reality, the reflexivity part would be probably discussed in more detail in a methods section. But my point here is that the identities that I've shared are really directly relevant to the research question. being queer would be relevant to the research question. Same with being cisgender. Working in a cancer genetics clinic and having experience with qualitative research, also directly relevant to the research question. Talking about reflexivity is very important. And again, to the retrofitting, often we're talking to people about, in our response, best practices and qualitative articles, and then we see people do what I think is making up things that they didn't actually do throughout the process. So again, if you do find yourself in that game of Jenga where you maybe didn't do everything methodologically congruently, at least like being transparent about that. But that's why we also want to think early on about how we're going to engage in reflexive processes and what's congruent with our actual method. And finally, this is an example of a joint position statement, which is realistically what most people need to do for a method section of a study, because usually you should be working with a research team. And so it's relevant to talk about the researchers' identities from all of the authorship team, even though you might specifically point to some specific authors, like the first author, if they were a genetic counseling student at the time of the study, that might be important to say, for example. But you might say something like, our research team includes genetic counselors and oncologists with expertise in qualitative research, transgender health, and clinical cancer genetics. Several team members are transgender, most are LGBTQ+. To maintain reflexivity, we kept team journals, held regular discussions about assumptions, and consulted with community advisors. So again, thinking about how can you concisely even talk about the overall experiences and identities of a research team, you might include something like, something about the first author, if they were most involved in the study, giving a little bit more information. But positionality statements do not have to be long. You can make joint positionality statements that are fairly pithy. And I say that again because sometimes we're like, add a positionality statement, and then we get a 2-pager. And while it's great that authors are willing to disclose all that information, it's not necessary for a qualitative method section. And so again, at its core, positionality, considering reflexive practices, the goal is to increase transparency in how we're approaching qualitative research. Key goal is to protect marginalized communities. Often communities are exploited by researchers with privilege. And so making sure our research isn't just voyeuristic and actually we're doing research that might benefit communities. It's also to help us acknowledge power dynamics inherent in the research process. Positionality statements are not without critique. Some people think that they actually reinforce the hierarchies that they're aimed to help out with, especially if a researcher uses it as a way to assert authority or legitimacy. Sometimes it's viewed as a way for guilt reduction, especially for privileged researchers. Some argue that they're used as a way for dominant researchers to claim superiority without actually addressing the power imbalances. And again, positionality statements have extremely limited impact if they aren't included with rigorous methods, because if we're just slapping on a positionality statement at the end, it's not actually addressing any reflexive practices or thinking about how our own identities and roles really shape the research. It's just an afterthought. I got a little timing thing, so we're gonna go quicker. So again, we need to think about it with methodology and not just tacking on a positionality statement, because that makes your study inclusive. And at the same time, there are other issues that come up with positionality statements. For example, I think about all the pressures for researchers with marginalized identities to include their positionality in articles that are posted online, and that are pretty much impossible to change. I think about immigrants, and if you're doing a research study related to immigration, thinking about increased ICE raids and thinking about how it might not be safe for someone to disclose immigration status, for example, in a manuscript. I think about transgender people and the increasing political attacks on trans folks. People should not be required to add something to a positionality statement. Puts people at increased risk for harm and scrutiny. And so it's really important that when we're thinking about these statements, we don't force anyone to disclose something that they don't want to disclose. It should be something that people want to disclose, or you can always do a group statement that can help protect authors too. Say you have an authorship team of 10 people, maybe it's safer to say, several of the authors are immigrants, for example, instead of saying who it exactly is. It can add some protection, but again, we should not be making our authors disclose anything. So again, sometimes positionality statements can really be geared to this center of whiteness and really not thinking about how it actually could put some of our authorship team in jeopardy too. So that's what I have for the talk. And our first activity is two parts. First, we're going to have you reflect on your positionality and draft a statement. So I want you to think about a research study that you've been involved in, or if you are actively involved in, think about when you're actively involved in, and think about drafting a positionality statement that you could include in the methods section. Guiding questions for this would be, which aspects of your identity are relevant to this work? How does your background shape your interactions? And what assumptions or biases might influence your work? We're going to be sharing these statements with your table mates later. So I just want to put that out there in case you write something that's very deeply personal and you don't want to talk to people you don't know about it. Think about the fact that you will be sharing these with your table mates. So we're going to give you, do we have 20 minutes? We're going to give you the full 20 minutes to draft that statement. If you're working on several projects too, think about how the statement might be different. So maybe they're totally different topics. Think about that too. Thank you so much.
Before we begin the facilitated discussion of the positionality statements that you've crafted, we've got a number of really, really excellent questions that came from the audience. So Kim is going to work through one or two of those questions. And then when we facilitate the discussion, we'll select 3 groups that are courageous enough to share their positionality statements and working through it with the help of your facilitators. But first, let's do a quick Q&A from Kim, and then we'll facilitate 3 groups to share their position statements.
Okay, I've heard a number of the questions so far. One question came about how disclosing positionality to participants. And so something I didn't talk about is sometimes it actually is really important to either on your research flyers or in an interview, for example, disclose your relationship to the topic to your participants. So for example, I've worked on teams that say like, as a queer-led study on the research flyer to get, to gain a little bit of rapport with participants, for example, to disclose, like this is kind of in community research, or in a research study, like telling a participant that like, oh, I've worked in a clinic related to Turner syndrome. I don't personally have Turner syndrome, but I've worked in that setting, telling your participant like a little bit about who you are in relation to the topic and your motivations for doing it. Like I'm doing this research because I think I really believe in whatever motivation you have for the research study. Another question that I heard, I think came from somewhere over here that Krista relayed to me was about like discussing the power dynamics between a student and faculty members and like sometimes differentiating who's doing what, like because maybe you're a faculty member with a certain positionality, but actually the first author student did most of the work. And so that's also part of the methods being like the first author is the one who coded the manuscript and then discussed with the rest of the research team the different themes that were conceptualized, right? And then maybe you'll have a little bit more about the positionality of the first author specifically in a positionality statement being like, the first author was a giant counseling student at the time of the research study and holds X, Y, or Z relationship to the topic. I'm trying to think of what other question, Rachel gave me a question that was like, is it past or present tense? And I think that depends on what you're reporting. Like at the time of the study, I was a clinical genetic counselor, but maybe I'm not anymore. But maybe it's something that is not a changing identity. So like I am LGBTQ. And so the tense of it might just depend on what exactly you're reporting. I also do, now I'm just spieling. I'd love to hear what other questions that you have if you have any.
I feel like maybe I just haven't read enough papers, but I feel like I haven't seen positionality like statements very often. Is it just something that you feel like the Journal of Genetic Counseling is doing, or do you see it a lot more? I haven't been asked for one in my like limited experience publishing, so I was just curious if like you should always have it or only do it if someone asks for it.
Yeah, I would say positionality statements in qualitative. Yes, so the question was, are positionality statements common practice, or is this just something that is new or done in the Journal of Genetic Counseling? And I'd say they're really well regarded in qualitative research in general to enhance the rigor of qualitative research. I think the Journal of Genetic Counseling has been pushing for more rigor recently, and which is why you'll see an uptick in recent articles. Also, often they're not like explicitly like positionality statements, here's the statement. They're often embedded within the methods, not being directly called positionality statements. I will say too, different journals have different word counts. So sometimes like trying to make a qualitative research article 3,000 words is words is near impossible. And so sometimes they'll be extremely pithy, or you'll even have a supplemental methods.
One thing I think would be helpful to talk about, I know we talked about it in preparing for the session, was really the difference between positionality and reflexality statement and then a conflict of interest statement, because I think sometimes people can conflate these.
Yeah, so conflicts of interest are usually like if you have a financial tie to the project, like is it a conflict of interest that I'm like a consultant on something XYZ company or something like that. So I think often when people are like, I have no relevant conflicts of interest, usually it's like specifically a financial conflict of interest. I don't think our identities or our experiences are conflicts of interest, or even in my perspective as a constructivist person, biases. I think they just inform the research process, whereas conflicts are like, could this thing feasibly like financially incentivize me to present this data in a different way?
Andy Ullman, University of Michigan. I'm just going to share an observation, which is just, I come from the generation of non-disclosure. You are not supposed to share anything about yourself at all. So it's interesting here as I go into my mid-60s that it's going to be a quick pivot to share everything, or at least, so I was just thinking, like, I will say some of my research lately, like I work with genetic counseling students, and last two projects I mentored were on use of AI, and also on issues of data sharing. So I could say that my research is informed by the fact that I'm in my mid-60s and I'm trying to get up to date on the use of the new technologies. So maybe I should be disclosing that in my articles these days.
I think part of that too is that quantitative research has really been upheld as like best practice in research, and qualitative research is kind of like gaining respect more. And so I think, although I think these things apply just as much to quantitative research, plug for that, I think we don't see a lot about disclosure because it's really best practice in qualitative right now, but I'm hoping that'll also go into quantitative land. Any final questions before we go into the like sharing bit?
I'm just thinking, okay, generally. So my name's Sarah Skolnick. I'm thinking about in working with students, because I think students are kind of operating and they do what they're told to do. So how, if they are asked during a thesis project and they're trying to publish to create one of these, how we protect them from not disclosing more than they might be comfortable disclosing if they feel like they have to.
Totally. And I think this honestly just comes from in my opinion, and I'm sure other people have other strategies, which I'd love to hear, just talking to students, being like, this is something that is good practice for this. Like, think about what you're comfortable having on basically for anyone to know, because we have to assume anyone can get hold of a published manuscript and really considering it. We shouldn't be patronizing in any way. Like if we have a student, we're like, you shouldn't put that XYZ identity on it, but we can say like, I as an author think about this, like I'm like something I'm sometimes wary of is putting this on it, and even just like talking about our own thought processes and modeling that for students so they can be thoughtful about it. And just again, reminding them that like anyone might be able to access this. Because I think sometimes people forget that you can't change things really once they're published. It's kind of hard to, so just reminding them of that. I see Krista has her hand up too. Yeah, I think about this a lot because I do a lot of research with, as I said, transgender trainees and colleagues, and we've talked about this a lot. And again, we need to make sure people opt in to writing anything about themselves. And also, I'd say best practice is to do a joint statement, just because I think practically speaking, individual statements get really long and kind of unnecessary, and we can say things a lot more concisely. So I think two birds, one bread, or whatever the share this.
Another example before we switch gears, it doesn't always have to be the identities. For example, if you're working with NF1, saying that I do not have NF1. Or if you have a niece that has NF1 or a nephew, informing the research as well. So zoom out and also see how these can be relevant to your specific research project. For the last 15 minutes, guys, that we have before we take our break, I'm going to invite two of the groups at this point because we're running a little bit low on time. So two groups that would like to share their positionality statement as well as the teamwork that occurred at your table in crafting said statement. We have a microphone on this side of the room and we have one on my side of the room as well. So would be open to any group that is courageous enough to share their process.
One last thing I'll say, sorry to derail,
Go for it.
is if you're reporting something about a friend or family member, ask for their permission. Like if you're inspired to do a research project because you have a sibling with like NF1, for example, maybe that sibling does not want that blasted on a research paper. So again, the opting in part also applies to if you have that experience. Yes, who's brave enough to share?
Alrighty, come to a stopping position with your conversations. We are going to begin the second half of our workshop. And we're going to kick it off with Tasha Weinstein again, and she's going to discuss guidelines for reporting qualitative research. After you.
Great. Thanks, Cameron. So the good news is this is the last didactic portion of the workshop. So after this, we're just going to be doing lots of fun activities instead of listening to me talk. Excuse me. So, okay, so you'll remember this slide from earlier. And one aspect of quality that we haven't really spoken about yet is how do we use reporting guidelines and checklists to enhance the quality of the work that we do. And at the outset, I really just want to say that it's important to acknowledge these guidelines can be really valuable, not disputing that at all, but they shouldn't be sort of construed as gospel. Okay, so if something is in a guideline, that doesn't mean you absolutely have to do that thing. Okay, you can deviate from guidelines. Best practice in that case would be to provide an explanation or a justification of why you have deviated from a particular guideline if you're using one. So just want to chat a little bit about like the pros and cons in a little bit more detail. Obviously, these guidelines can have advantages in terms of the transparency angle. So sometimes because qualitative research is so vast and different, having this set of guidelines that you are working with can be helpful to allow you to transparently tell everybody what it is you're doing based on the set of guidelines that have been provided for a particular method or methodology. I think they're also helpful because they offer this kind of structure that will help you put together the really key components that you need to deliver in a way that is useful for the knowledge users or the audience that you're trying to reach. And sometimes they can help take something that's quite intangible and make it more overt so you know that that's something that you need to have included in the work. However, this needs to sort of be balanced against some of the limitations or perhaps disadvantages of using checklists and guidelines. And some people will argue that they are actually philosophically at odds completely with doing qualitative research because they reduce qualitative research to this idea of just being very proceduralist, right? You're just doing these things because they are part of a process, not because you've given it the attention that we were trying to, get to today with regards to methodological coherence and working on reflexivity and positionality. So some people do have an issue with the whole concept of having guidelines when it comes to qualitative research. But on balance, I think they can be really helpful if we approach them in a way that we acknowledge that they are just guidelines. And so you'll notice that that is actually, for me at least, an intentional word choice. I refer to them as guidelines, not checklists, to try and convey that idea that this is something that is going to, help guide us, but we're not going to use it as a checklist where we're just ticking off these boxes and saying, okay, we've done steps 1 through 10, therefore we've got high quality, great, done. Okay, so we're going to try and focus on the idea that these are guidelines. I think the other issue, main issue really, with using these types of tools is they, as it says here, fail to acknowledge the conceptual and methodological diversity. So we've discussed this. There are so many ways to do qualitative research that finding one guideline that works regardless of what particular choices you use is going to be really, really challenging to do. Because they make this assumption that what we're doing in one paradigm with one method is going to apply equally to everything. And that's just not the case, as I think hopefully you've seen over the course of this workshop so far. So having said that, I did just want to say that the Journal of Genetic Counseling does, and not only our journal, many others, require the inclusion wherever possible. If somebody is of that view that this is completely out of keeping with qualitative research and gives us a lot of reasons why they're not going to do this, I don't think anybody at the journal would be like, well, we're not going to publish this. But in general, we do find it helpful to allow for that transparency to come through. So this is just some examples. There are many others. But what I really want to just reflect on here is this idea that some of the guidelines address conveying these ideas at the paradigm level, whereas others are very specific to a data analysis. Sorry, my South African accent just came through very strongly there. Data analysis level. Okay, so it's very specific about this type of method or this specific method. It's not necessarily something that can be used more broadly in the context of a paradigm. So the paradigm level ones are things like CoreQ. That's probably the most well known. There's also SRQR, which I'm actually not even remembering what that stands for, but there are links there. So if you want to have a look at that. And those tend to be more typically used for post-positivist paradigms. And then a much more recent one is the Big Q qualitative research guidelines, which is, as you can see, specific for Big Q or more constructivist or at least non-positivist ways of thinking about research. And then at the data analysis level, we have the reflexive thematic analysis reporting guidelines. So that's very specific for RTA. It doesn't work for all types of thematic analysis. Important to see that and acknowledge it. And then some aren't even formal guidelines. Sometimes it's just a paper where somebody has very kindly written out what would be helpful to consider in a particular type of method. So there's one for interpretative phenomenological analysis, and there's also one for grounded theory. But even then, you might still have to go digging a little bit further because something like grounded theory can be positivist, can be constructivist, can be even critical. So just to be thinking carefully about your paradigm so that you know that what you're doing when it comes to the checklist or the guideline, that still remains methodologically coherent. Okay, so just to go through some of the most common ones, very briefly, CoreQ is the consolidated reporting framework. And the authors say that it exists for any type of qualitative design. I do want to point out that there's been a lot of criticism about CoreQ. And I've put some examples there, and for two main reasons. One is that if you look at the method that they used to create CoreQ, there's a lot of concerns about how they actually put it together. It was based on the literature review of other checklists, and so it's not the most robust way of approaching something like this. Because just because it occurred in somebody else's literature review doesn't mean that that's necessarily a good marker of quality. And the other is more along the lines of what I was saying earlier about trying to fit, in this case, very positivist ideas of research and making it applicable to all paradigms. And it doesn't do that very well. So if you are using a post-positivist approach, CoreQ is probably going to be great. And you can go ahead and do that. But if you're potentially using something else, even though they position this as you can do it for any qualitative research, just maybe see if there's something else that might be better. So the Big Q qualitative reporting guidelines, as I mentioned, are much newer and tend to be more for the evaluation of non-positivist qualitative research. And here, if you read the paper, you'll see that it's based very much on values. Okay, so the values we spoke about earlier, the researcher's subjectivity, the idea of co-creation, the idea of there being multiple realities that we can learn from and understand in a very subjective way, rather than there being ideas around consensus, which is what Core Q uses. And here, as I said, the emphasis on guidelines. Okay, so it's not this rigorous thing that you have to make sure you're ticking off absolutely everything on this list that they provide. It's a lot more about using that information to ensure methodological congruence and reflexivity in what you're doing. This one's really awesome, I think, because it provides things that you could consider, but it also says here's some stuff that maybe you should avoid if you want to work in a more big Q kind of approach, which I think is wonderful. And there's notes, as you can see, for reviewers and editors as well. So this is somebody I was chatting with before in the break. The idea of methodological congruence does absolutely apply to reviewers and editors as well. And you can, if you're in a position where you're reviewing something, it's helpful to look at these guidelines as well to make sure that what you're reviewing is methodologically congruent. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. Okay, the last one is the reflexive thematic analysis. And I will say, and I think hopefully Kim will back me up on this, unfortunately, RTA is one of the ones we see the most common, and it is by far the most egregiously done one, unfortunately, despite the fact that there's so many resources available. So I would strongly recommend that anybody doing RTA is looking at the reporting guidelines and making sure that you are using that to frame your study in an appropriate, methodologically congruent way. The other thing, I think I said this already, that it's really specific to reflexive thematic analysis. It does not apply to code book or coding reliability, TA. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Those would be more appropriate to be used with post-positivist or positivist guidelines. And just before I move on, I think a lot of people have asked me in the past, well, like, how do you choose if you should be looking at a paradigm level or a data analysis level? And my sort of approach is, if there is something that's specific to the method you're using, start there. So for example, this one, if you're doing reflexive thematic analysis, I would use this guideline, but that doesn't mean you can't also use, for example, the big Q qualitative reporting guidelines as well. Okay, they work well together. Again, just make sure they're methodologically congruent if you're using both. If there's nothing that exists for the particular method that you're using, then you would default to a paradigm level guideline like Core Q or Big Q as an example. Okay, last part, as I said, I think we also need to recognize that methodological congruence is something that reviewers and editors can also apply to the process of getting qualitative research out into the world. And so there was a fantastic paper written also recently about how the kinds of struggles that qualitative researchers have had when they submit their papers to journals, and they have people who are probably in most cases either quantitative researchers or at least post-positivist researchers reviewing their work and then sending back all of this feedback that's completely methodologically incongruent. So based on that paper and some of the stuff that I've seen and tried to do for my own processes is some further tips on how do we do that. So the first one is ask yourself, do you have sufficient expertise or familiarity to conduct a peer review of a qualitative research manuscript? And if the answer is no, it's absolutely fine to decline the request to review on that basis if you don't feel confident to do it. Or if you are a subject matter expert, to confine your review to the content itself and tell the editors that, just so you know, I've reviewed this from the perspective of the content. I have not necessarily paid as much attention to the methods, or I'm going to give you some things about the methods, but I acknowledge I could be wrong because that's not my area of expertise. So that's a really transparent way of doing it, and I think really helpful. What we at the journal have tried to do is ensure that when we have our two reviewers, at least one of them has methodological experience, but our whole process is filtered through the deputy editors who are applying their qualitative sort of lens on things as well. So we have that as a sort of backup mechanism. Okay, let's say you do agree to do the review. The next thing to think about is, have you evaluated the qualitative research within the context of the relevant qualitative values or the philosophical paradigms, rather than applying either quantitative assumptions. So we're not going to look for the validity and the reliability and the objectivity and the reproducibility, right? We're going to say, okay, well, this is a constructivist paradigm, so I would like to see co-creation. I would like to see researcher subjectivity in the form of a positionality statement. I would like to see the explicit statement of what paradigm this is, so that I can be assured that I'm reviewing this appropriately. And then taking it a step further, have you evaluated the research approach on its own merits rather than on the parameters of another or your preferred qualitative approach? So for example, if you've worked with grounded theory before, make sure that you are evaluating the methodology based on what that person or those authors have done, not what you understand about things because you've done grounded theory before. Okay. And then finally, with caveats that we've discussed about guidelines, not checklists, does the reporting align with the guideline specific to its use or to a generally applicable one? And we know there if it doesn't align, but they've appropriately justified that, we're great, we're happy. And that's all I really have to say on this topic, unless you have questions, which I'm happy to answer.
We do have 10 minutes left for Q&A. What do you have for Tasha?
I don't have a question so much as a comment. You know, a lot of us have made comments, and I know a lot of us work with students. And I think that doing something that requires a checklist is actually a really helpful structure for students that are learning to do qualitative research. Because it's so clearly spelled out. And so if you have a student that is interested in doing qualitative research, particularly if you're someone in this room that hasn't done a lot of qual research yourself, guiding them towards a research question and a paradigm and methodology that allows them to use one of these checklists.
Yeah, I would agree. I think they have massive utility in terms of the sort of lessening the learning curve around this stuff. The other thing, sorry, that I should have said in the talk is don't only think about these right at the end when you're getting ready to submit to a journal. Think about it right from the beginning and use that throughout the process of the research to guide what you're doing. That was just the other thing I wanted to add. Cool, thanks.
What else are folks curious about?
Do you ever, have you ever, would you recommend, how would you think through the sort of beaten down, do I just use a second code over some proportion of transcripts because of the eventual audience that I want to reach and what I'm anticipating about the reviewers, even if I don't think that it adds value, is worth a lot of time, and is congruent?
I feel your pain. I can hear it in the way you asked the question, the frustration. Yeah, so that paper that I mentioned that they asked reviewers, they asked authors to give examples of methodologically incongruent feedback that they'd gotten from reviewers deals a lot with this of like, how do we manage that? And I think, unfortunately, in the fact, because we're positioned within an allied health discipline, we are going to, for I don't know how much longer, but foreseeable future, have to deal with the fact that most of the people who are reviewing our work are going to come at this from a more quantitative, more post-positivist perspective. And I like to try and take the position of being an educator in that position of like, I understand that maybe this is less familiar to you. And so I'm going to maybe take this opportunity to explain to you why two coders is not even necessary, but inappropriate and methodologically incoherent for the type of paradigm that I'm working in. And we can try, we can be nice about that and when we write it nicely. In that paper, there's actually a supplementary table where they give you wording to use to respond to reviewers who are giving you this methodologically incongruent feedback. Super useful, literally copy and paste, you're done. So I think I like to try and take that position of, I'm going to try and explain this to you because I understand that you don't have the methodological expertise, and they haven't approached this in a methodologically congruent way as from their review. I also hope that editors in that situation will intervene to say, so that those kinds of comments are moderated by an editor. I think I can speak for the journal that we certainly have been doing that. But yeah, I do really appreciate the frustration, and I do think it stops a lot of people from pursuing this avenue because they know that they're going to come up against this again and again. But if we can try all take on a little bit of the mantle of, okay, we're going to educate our colleagues about how we do this in a really rigorous way in the qualitative space, hopefully that will have like a long-term good impact. But yeah, I very much share your frustration. And it does take a lot more work to write these responses to reviewers when you have to explain basics to them, like why you don't need 2 coders or other examples. So yeah. I fully agree with you. And I also just want to say that like I appreciate that a lot of what you've heard today is very much, myself, Krista, I think, and Kim have all said we're more of the big Q kind of researchers. That doesn't negate the value of small Q. And I think if your audience is somebody like a bunch of cardiologists, maybe small Q is a better way to go, right? Because you do need to think about your audience in terms of how they're going to take up these findings. And if they are going to value something that has a little bit more of the objectivity and the robustness that they're used to, then that's an important reason to make that call. So I do agree with you. And yes, the supplementary materials is definitely a good space to provide your methodological coherence aspects. I would add that I have been trying to certainly push back a little bit on on editors who tell me that my papers are too long. For that exact reason, to try and convey the methodological congruence takes space. And I think that this kind of work deserves that. So I personally have been trying to push back a little bit on that, but it's a little bit of a one-person army, I think, at this point. So something to think about. And we don't print and publish things on paper anymore. So I struggle to understand the reason to limit the words so extensively when that is no longer a concern from a pricing perspective, especially since we pay so much to have these things published in the first place. But that's a whole different workshop. So yeah, I'll get off my bandwagon there before
I was going to say, Sasha, you're not alone. You now have an army of men today.
Great. I love it.
We are out of time because we're actually about to do an activity. We're about to do a workshop with it. Yeah, really good comment. Yeah.
Single versus double. Okay, so I think if you actually look at qualitative research from where it originally started in social sciences, so if we look at the philosophers, the sociologists, the psychologists, single coder is the default. I think that somehow got missed when there was this move towards doing qualitative work in an allied health medical context where we were getting so much pushback around, well, how do you know that it's objective, right? So in a positivist paradigm, 2 coders is great. If you have that ability, you have 2 people and you want to do that, no problem. The goal is different here. The goal here is in a positivist paradigm, you're trying to say that those 2 coders have consensus on what the actual code is. In a constructivist big Q setting, you don't need them. You can absolutely only have 1 coder. However, there are certainly instances where you can have more than 1 coder. However, the focus is different. It's not about reaching consensus. There's 2 main reasons why you would want a second coder in a more big Q sort of setting. One is because your first coder, which I think applies to many people here, is probably a student and has never done anything like this before. And so your second coder is there to provide educational, pedagogical sort of support to that very novice researcher. See, not about consensus, okay? About teaching, lovely. The second is also not about consensus, and that is sometimes you may want to have people who have different positionalities bringing those lenses to what you're studying. And so having more than 1 coder in a big Q setting would be really helpful if you want to achieve that sort of aspect of having these different positionalities, bringing all of their perspectives to an analysis. But again, it's not about reaching consensus about this code means this thing and is very objective. It's about collaborative coding in that sense, that we're coming together to make a call about what we think is happening with these data, and that is informing the analysis. So I hope that answers the question. Great.
Yeah, and I'm actually glad that we made space for that, because your activity will be drawing on the information that was just shared by Tasha. So for the next 60 minutes, we're going to perform a facilitated journal club activity. Can I get a show of hands quickly who has the link to the Padlet that was already sent out? Fantastic. Buddy up if you do not have the link to the Padlet with somebody who does. The papers will be all digital, and we'll be reviewing them digitally. So I'm going to give a couple moments now to kind of partner up and organize your team with folks who do have the link to the Padlet with the journal articles. So let me actually pull it up. Don't be shy. You've introduced yourselves. Let's partner up. It's going to be engaging for the next hour. Articles that we'll be working through for the next hour today. So they are here on our left, Articles 1 and Article 2. Now, what will you be working on in terms of these articles? First, we will review the articles. Each of those articles are grounded in a different philosophical paradigm, either a constructivist paradigm or a positivist paradigm. First, you're going to try and identify that research paradigm. That's your very first goal. Review the paper, then identify which paradigm is at play within that paper, either a constructivist or a positivist paradigm. And if they're different, note any inconsistencies within that methodology as well. Next, if you can find it, please discuss the positionality of the authors that are in that paper. Your second objective is to discuss the positionality in that paper if you can see it. And additionally, we'll consult any guidelines that are available with your core Q, other guidelines, and critique it using those guidelines. We're going to see if we can get these instructions here. So this is it. See your mouse is right.
Oh.
Yeah, if you can find it, so use your eyes. Oh, this one? Yes. I think that's it. Most of what I've mentioned is listed on the screen here to the left. So again, we're already in groups. We've got a facilitator. We're discussing the strengths and the limitations of the article based on its methodological congruence. You also can critique it to see how it might have been able to be revised. You're identifying the research paradigm, noting any incongruence, discussing the positionality, and consulting the guideline that responds to that paradigm. We will be wrapping up within 60 minutes, and then we also have some time after this to discuss the facilitated activity too, okay? And luckily after this, there's a break. So I'm gonna go ahead and put on some music to get you guys started. Your instructions are here on the right hand on the screen. Again, you guys are divided into working on Article 1 and Article 2 with your instructions above. If you have any questions, please refer to your facilitator to help coach you through this section. Thank you. Alrighty, please come to a close with your discussion with your groups. Alrighty, we've got a couple of guiding questions for you to help facilitate the work that you've already done within your groups. But the expert panel is curious about two particular things. The first thing that we're curious about is that, was there something that from the answer key or sort of checklist that we provided for you in the Padlet that you guys overlooked within your group that the expert reviewers found, and vice versa? Were there things that you identified in your papers that the expert reviewers did not? That's our first question to sort of get curious and think about, is based on that checklist that was provided in the Padlet, were there things that you might have overlooked? And then what might you have discovered that we did not? Both myself and Darius will be around the room with our microphones. Actually, and Kim and Darius will be around the room with the microphones for anybody who would like to share publicly with the group. Let's collectively learn. Thank you.
I'll also thank you. I'll also add just we probably should have provided some context about how you can use the documents that we added. We used the little green checkbox to signify that that was a place where congruence was like supported. Y'all are nodding like you figured that out. I'm glad that y'all figured that out. Yeah, our secret codes. And then I think we had like a little X in places where like we recognized that they needed to do it. Red exclamation point. Thank you.
Our second activity, which is going to be hands-on, like our first two were today, is also going to involve group work. So if you have separated from your group or gotten lost from your group, go ahead and find one. Also, feel free to switch it up and meet some new people, get some new perspectives. But we are going to have you guys in groups for our final activity for today. Alrighty. For this exercise, we've also got about 45 to 50 minutes carved out to conduct this last activity. But this is going to be using a simulated research scenario. So in the Padlet, again, for the folks who do have their Padlet, it's going to be in the middle section on during the session, where we have our simulated research scenarios where we choose a research question. Alrighty, so here you're going to find a research question, and you're going to try and answer them with qualitative methods. So you're going to, of course, discuss the research paradigm. And let me see if I can get the slide that has it pulled up so you guys can follow along while I review this. And yeah, look at that, already prepped. Love. Cool. Groups of 6 to 8. Facilitator. Also, our facilitators, if they've not already found a group, they can do so here. But again, choosing a paradigm based on the research question, applying its key assumptions and design to the study. Also make sure that you select your data collection methods. Are you using interviews? Are you using observations? Are you using focus groups? Consider how you're going to analyze said data once it comes back. And making sure, of course, methodological coherence, while we're here, that it aligns with the lens of your chosen paradigm. Additionally, discuss the implications of your approach and consider your positionality as it relates to the chosen research question. And as it says on the bottom, you'll get to think, pair, share with the group next to you for this activity. So once again, work with your groups. Please pick a research scenario, discuss and choose a paradigm, and then you'll have about 45 to 50 minutes on the clock to get started. On your marks, get set, go for it. Alrighty, for the remainder of our time, we're going to be using this to really share a lot of our learning, but specifically focus on this most recent activity. This recent activity gave you essentially almost a real world scenario of students or yourself coming up with a research topic or idea, but really thinking through the steps of how do I achieve methodological coherence? How do I make sure to account for the strengths and weaknesses of the approach that I selected? Where does my positionality actually influence either my analysis of this work or the interpretation of this work? So for the next 20 minutes, I'm very curious to hear from the groups on your question that you selected. So whenever if you have the courage to get the microphone, please share the question that you tackled, as well as one of your approaches. And as a collective, we will begin to share our feedback on your thoughts to that approach. But also at the very last resort, we'll have our expert panel sort of weigh in. But you guys have learned a lot over the past 5 hours. So I want you guys to share, and then we'll be able to work through some of the approaches that are listed. But for the next 20 minutes, let's go ahead and dive into some of the research questions. Darius has a microphone for those who are willing. And then remind me again of your name.
I'm Lily.
And
Hello.
Lily has got a microphone in the audience.
I feel like we're a tribunal up here. Not the intent.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I'll share that then. One of the things that was interesting about the discussion here is that Cindy's group shared a great idea that initially I flagged as having some incoherence, because they said they were going to use phenomenology for a question that was not about experiences. And so I flagged that. And then we looked at the definition of phenomenology and reflexive analysis and realized that they've been talking about reflexive analysis the entire time, but using the wrong term. And so in reality, the plan was congruent. They just had the wrong words. So I think that like double checking everything, having a cheat sheet with the definitions of everything, and like having like a quick summary of what the different analysis types are is really helpful. And also, as Cameron just said, we all have taken in a lot of information today. And so it's not, no shame on y'all or anybody for mixing up phenomenology and reflexive analysis in this moment. But I just loved it because y'all actually had a wonderful idea. We were just using the wrong words.
Can you tell us which question it was?
Yeah, it was the one about sex chromosome. Yeah. So, and we also talked about how if that question was just tweaked slightly to say the experiences of patients, then phenomenology would have been appropriate, which I think speaks to like the importance of identifying a clear research question, whereas it was expectations, which is why we left it.
Sure. So I think the truly positivist is where there is this absolute sort of devotion almost to objectivity, to a single truth that can be known from the data. Whereas post-positivist, which I think is probably more accurate for most of the time, is where we are acknowledging that so you still have that objectivity idea. So you believe that the world or the truth or the reality can be objectively known, but that we as humans are imperfect and that contributes to the sort of limitations of knowing that objective truth. So it does allow for a little bit more space for researcher, I suppose, subjectivity and how we are not able to fully know that objective truth, if that makes sense. Yeah. Cool.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that one, Tasha? That doesn't go in your limitations, right? But it goes in your interpretation of the work?
Yeah, or your methodology of sort of positioning so it's positioning the whole study really. So you could talk about that in your methodology as this is the framework that we're viewing this. We're aiming for something that's objective, but we also acknowledge that it's going to be imperfect. Yeah. And if we carried on studying it, we would know more and be able to achieve a greater degree of objectivity.
That's well said. Yes.
If I can add to that as well, your use of mixed methods as well as the framing of the question also gives way to a pragmatism approach. But if like you're thinking that outcomes might be to develop resources or structures to support geneticists. And we also talked about how the question that this group was doing could be spun into pragmatism. And I actually think that pragmatism fits with a lot of genetic counseling research because so much of what we're thinking about is like, how can this impact clinical care? And that's what pragmatism is about promoting change. And I feel like we haven't talked about that as much today, but want to make sure to like keep that in the back of your mind as well, because that could be a really great framework to use.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to welcome you and invite you for a round of applause for your excellent work and commitment for our qualitative research workshop. I'd also like to invite you to give a round of applause to our expert panelists. Krista, Tasha, Kim. May I also welcome a round of applause for our facilitators in the audience. Can I also give a round of applause to our session organizer, Dr. Rachel Mills. finally, I'm going to give a shout out to myself.